What is Christian peace building? And why would we respond to a violent situation with practical steps to build peace rather than retaliation? Good morning. After yesterday's bombings, I've seen and heard a lot of violent reactions from Christian leaders and people who claim they want to follow Jesus. I hear a lot of people calling for revenge, for merciless persecution of the people who did these bombings. And that's understandable. To want to respond and even escalate violence against someone who did something violent against us is a very human reaction. But it's not the way of Jesus. Choosing to follow Jesus and his teachings and to be consistent with the early church is committing to a path of redemption and of healing, despite whatever's happened to us. This interview is with a friend of mine who's spent 11 years working in violent contexts in the southern Philippines. And she is going to tell us a story about how she realized very viscerally why nonviolence sometimes is the more practical case. In the end, Christian nonviolence isn't always a path of practicality. It is always a path of faithfulness, though. If Jesus is really our Lord and King, and following him brings us to the path of life and not the path of death and destruction. If following him is walking in the resurrection, then whether we live or whether we die, the church is called to be a witness of the way of life. And so choosing the way of nonviolence is choosing the way of redemption always, because it's a way of faith. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Okay, I'm here with Kriz Cruzado, a peace-building worker from the southern Philippines. 11 years doing peace-building work in the southern Philippines, in the northern Philippines, in the central Philippines. And I'm going to get her to tell us a couple stories about how peace and reconciliation has been part of her faith journey and her personal convictions in transformation. So Kriz, first, hi.
Hi.
Kriz and I have known each other for like 8 years.
Yeah.
And we're celebrating because she just got into a peace-building program in Canada, where she'll be doing an MA in peace-building and collaborative development. But you have tons of experience in the field. So, can you tell us a story? Tell me a story about when you first realized that peace and nonviolence were a really important part of transforming conflict areas. Because some people believe that violence is the only option to really suppress, violent situations.
Well, I am like those typical people who think that you can only end violence with violence. I am aware that my country, the Philippines, has been in so much pain in the last few decades already, like having this war in Mindanao, and not so many people around the world know about it. I am particularly aware of these conflicts because I used to live in Cotabato City. That's basically one of the cities near areas where armed conflict always happen. When I started, so I did a 3-year peace and development program with an organization in Cotabato City. And then in 2007, I came to work for Peace Builders. And my first conversation with my CEO, my team leader, Dan, was that violence is a way of, not violence, I mean, non-violence. We should embrace non-violence as peace builders, as peace building workers. We should embrace non-violence as a way of life, kind of thing. And I was just like telling him that it's not possible. Because to me, retaliation is something that you can justify. When somebody hits you, you can hit back, and that's fine.
And in Cotabato City, where you'd grown up, like you'd experienced the reality of that. Like that was the only option.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you don't hit back, you don't do something bad towards a person unless he does it first to you, right? So that's how, well, I kind of like mixed revenge from um, justice. So revenge and justice, I thought that they're like synonymous.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I grew up in a setting like that. And so when Dan and I had this conversation about embracing nonviolence, I was just like telling him, I don't think I can do it. And then Dan said, well, that's okay. I was just starting with my journey as a peace worker. And it was not until 2008, there was armed conflict in near Piquet in central Mindanao. And I went there to kind of like visit one of the evacuation centers there. And I saw two kids. They were like maybe 8 years old, 9 years old um, children, and I had this conversation with them. One kid had his father died in an armed clash between the government of the Republic of the Philippines, and the MILF, the more Islamic Liberation Front armies at the time. And the other kid had his brother died in the same war. And they were just like talking about how they want to be 10 years old already, because by then they could enlist themselves for a combat training.
At 10 years old.
At 10 years old. And I was just like, what? And they said, yeah, we have to avenge the death of our relatives.
And that's just a normal assumption.
But that's what I do too. Like I kind of justify it that way. And it was a moment of realization for me. And I kind of thought, wow, retaliation does not end violence. It continues on the cycle of violence. And you
through the
kind of
next generation.
I know, right? And you can't get anywhere with your with all these peace processes that you're doing.
Yeah.
And so it was at that moment when I realized that, okay, the violence has to stop at me. I will not retaliate. And I was thinking that there should be other ways to deal with conflict issues. And I wouldn't say that there's one prescription to that. Like, I think it's an ongoing dialogue amongst people.
Mm-hmm.
And people can always sit down and think of creative ways to deal with violence and conflict issues, as long as it's not, as long as it's redemptive and it's non-violence. There should be some other ways to do that. I mean, non-violence has worked since what? The time of Mahatma Gandhi, and even maybe before that.
Well, before that, I mean, even Jesus, even the
true,
early church, you have examples of using nonviolence, or sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. I mean, I think the perfect illustration of what you're saying, that Dan was a mentor, Kuya Dan was a mentor for us, or Pastor Dan was a mentor for us. Mm-hmm. He's known all over the Philippines for his radical nonviolence and Peace Builders community. You can go to peacebuilderscommunity.org to check out their website, and lots of stories from 8 years ago when Christina and I were both staff there as well with Chris. And Pastor Dan would always teach and illustrate that the cross is the perfect example of this nonviolence, and that the violence stops with Jesus. He stood there on the cross as God on earth, saying, whatever my creation will do to me in violence, it will stop with me. I'll absorb it. And in his death and then in his resurrection, violence was transformed. And the power of life overcame the power of death in that. And so that's what I always remember with Kuya Dan teaching us over and over, that the cross is the center of nonviolence. It's the perfect illustration of God himself taking the violence and sin and everything of this world on himself, it killing him, but it not being powerful enough to overcome him and overcome new creation.
Yes,
in
yes.
resurrection.
You're very right there. Like it's the perfect example of absorbing violence and not without. I mean, his death on the cross. There are a lot of violence done to him, and the way he responded to violence is so different with how people normally
Mm.
react to violence.
Yeah.
But he's a perfect example of that, and the death on the cross is not in vain because a lot of people came to believe and understood what nonviolence is.
Yeah.
So, in my journey, I think it's important when you're someone who has committed your life to peace building. I think it is important that you also understand your basics of your principles,
Yeah.
your values, like what makes you become a peace building worker. And I think for me, being a Christian and as someone who is trying to follow Anabaptism, is that Christ has to be the center of what we're doing,
Yeah.
of our personalities, of the way we are as human beings.
Yeah.
And that when we do peace building work, I think we have a role model, which is Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And, dealing with people, dealing with conflict situations, dealing with just difficult situations.
Yeah.
It's just that it's not always easy.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, even if you're a peace building worker, sometimes you find yourself facing situations that will challenge your sensitivities, that will challenge your principles.
Yeah.
And sometimes you react differently, and then you realize, well, that wasn't really the way I should have reacted.
Yeah.
But then you can redeem that. There's always a way, as long as you are committed and as long as you know who your model is.
Yeah.
I think that's very important. And for me as a peace building worker, my life has to be consistent with the things that I teach. Because I've been doing peace and reconciliation training. And since doing that, I have become aware of my own weaknesses as a person.
As a trainer.
When
you're standing in front of a crowd teaching this.
And it's kind of like everything boomerangs, it comes back, and I realize, well, I'm not really this exact person I'm trying to teach.
Yeah.
But then there has to be some consistency there with how you live your life and with the things that you teach people. Because that, I think, is a more powerful message than what you say in front of the people.
Cool. Well, this is one story, along with many other stories from this month. Thank you, Kriz, for sharing your life with me for years. And I'm glad we get to share some of your important story, that you get to inspire so many people as a trainer, as a peace-building worker in some really vulnerable areas, and learn with all the other peace builders in the world who are working hard. I think the church is this organization that is a channel of healing as we love God and love our neighbor, and our calling as the church is to be communities of healing in whatever place we are physically, and the social networks we're part of. And so we hope that, and I know you hope that, the church continues to grow and mature to be this organization that brings healing where it is, and redemption as the hands and feet of Jesus. Yeah?
Yeah, I
Cool.
agree with that.
Cool. See you next time.